So, by official government data, by the age of 14, about half of children in Britain are not living with both natural parents. And in 2022, which is the last year for which the Home Office uh, collects this data, a quarter of all families were single parent families.
Well, Dr. Bruce Newsome, welcome to the Coalition for Marriage YouTube channel, podcast, whatever this is, I don't know. It's great to have you here. Now, for those who don't know you, perhaps I can stagger a little introduction and then you can take over because there's a lot to say. But you are a prolific writer. You call yourself a recovering academic. And you've had lots of senior positions in academia in the UK and across there in the US. And you've written extensively on military history and risk, not the game, I'm guessing. And those are things which aren't normally subjects for C4M, but more recently, you've written a lot and you've commented about lots of family law matters to do with the UK. And those are things that concern C4M and parental right to children. And there's been some really interesting developments in the news just in the last few weeks, really, going through Parliament at the moment, a particular court case in February. So welcome. Great to talk to you. And by all means, please say hi to our viewers and our listeners.
Yes, thank you. And Tony, it's great to talk to you again. Thank you for the invitation. Yeah, well, I started out as a policy scientist, so I am trained as a political scientist. I specialize in policy. So my first job was actually as a policy scientist at a think tank, the RAND Corporation in Santa Monica, California. And so I'd mention that because that gets to why I have an interest in policies of all kinds. If I see a bad policy, it strikes my interest. And family law, or the policies around families in Britain, are bad. And that's why I've reported a lot on the injustices that particularly fathers suffer, and thence their children, and the abuses of the family law system, not just by the courts, but by the agencies of government, such as CAFCAS, and thence by schools and higher education, which we talked about in our last discussion, how safeguarding of children intentionally from abuse ends up being used to repress political views.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell us, I mean, what kind of, I mean, you're into policy per se, but what drew your considerable laser-like attention to family policy in the UK? How did you get into that situation?
So I am a father, and I have a personal interest in this as a father. I've seen it. I saw it before I became a father. I saw these injustices with my friends and other members of my family. So these injustices has been going on a long time. Britain is rife with policy problems, bad policies, all over the place: economic, social, political, military. Try to find a good policy that is actually being executed in the United Kingdom at the moment. But family law is differentiated from those other policy problems because, first of all, it attracts very little attention. And this infuriates me. It is unjust in itself, the fact that it doesn't draw attention. So there are injustices. There are civil injustices. There are statutory, case law, court jurisprudence, procedural, and executive, i.e. through the agencies of government, injustices in how family law is implemented. Britain claims to be a liberal country, and it's obsessed with equity and equality. And family law illustrates the converse, is that whenever the woke pursue equity, they end up reversing the discrimination. And you see that very starkly in family law, where I admit, decades ago, women were victimized in divorce, where their contribution to the household, particularly household income, would be undervalued by the court, and they could end up destitute. We're talking decades and decades ago. Those injustices have been righted, and then the system overcompensated. And yet the system still thinks of itself as liberal and equitable, and it's not. It is a case study in the counterproductiveness of righting an injustice and overcompensating for it.
I mean, this is the thing. This isn't imagination. This is a real thing, because I think I mentioned to you before the case of Felix Ngole, who on his social work course, he'd happened to mention on a Facebook post sometime earlier in response to a question that he thought marriage was between a man and a woman, and his course leaders, social workers, representatives of the profession, said that belief is not consistent with being a social worker. So there is this really deep embedded wokeness within social work as a profession. I'm not saying every social worker is woke, but there's good evidence that the profession leadership is, and you'd think then that rubs off on the people because they have to behave in accordance with what they think their leaders want them to do and say if they want to keep their jobs. And our interest in this from a policy perspective as a marriage organisation is that children, the idea of marriage is to ensure that children have access to their biological mum and dad, because the evidence says that's a really good thing for children and actually for adults. The happiest people in the world statistically are married with children. And I think one of the problems that seems to be permeating governments overtly at the moment, let's take, for example, the Courts and Tribunals Bill, which is just going through Parliament, and Clause 17, which we've written about at C4M previously, and the idea that the assumption, explicitly the assumption that a child does better with exposure to both parents, that assumption, as a default assumption, is being explicitly removed, or the proposal is to explicitly remove it. And the government's own research says that won't make any difference in the courts or anything else like that, to which they respond, no, but it'll send a signal. The signal being, if you listen to Baroness Levitt, who's the Justice Minister who spoke about this particular procedure and what they're looking for, she said, parenting is not a right, it's a privilege. And so the idea is that the government want to decide whether or not you deserve the privilege of parenting your own children, and that this is the message they now want to send into the courts and tribunal system. I can't imagine anything more horrific, especially, and so I'll shut up in a minute and give it back to you, Bruce, because you know what you're talking about. But especially given there was a judgment at the time of recording 4 weeks ago in February, Ray Y., as the case is anonymously referred to, of course, because it involves young children, where in fact a woman in this particular example had been denied access to her offspring for 6 years because of the testimony of an unqualified psychologist, which on review the court said was invalid. And in fact, they criticised, of course, CAFCAS and all of these procedures explicitly for denying parents access to their children on spurious grounds. And instead of fixing the broken system, which is made up of individuals which aren't following the correct procedures and the correct processes, they're in fact trying to change some strange signal about parenting, knowing that even the courts themselves have said that's not going to make any difference. Why don't you fix the system? What do you make of all that, Bruce?
There's a lot to unpack there. You're really on the ball, Tony, and that's why I appreciate the work you do and talking to you about this. So, one of the bottom lines I can draw underneath that last case you mentioned is that is in reaction to a lot of people who have no experience of the family court system will think, well, surely that can't be right. Any participant, any party to a family court case must be exaggerating when they say the court stops them from seeing their kids on spurious grounds, on non-evidentiary grounds, a single witness who is usually the other party. Or the people will say, well, surely you did something wrong. When the court says you should have less time with your kids, surely you did something wrong, and you're just not fessing up to it with your community of friends.
First of all, we know that the Clause 17 stuff is based on the fact that sometimes there is real abuse and children should be protected. But the evidence suggests that the failings that have taken place in the high-profile cases that a lot of us know about were failings of not using the current process properly. They didn't need a different signal. They just needed the people involved to use the current processes that were already in place, to follow through with the proper assessments and to make the proper decisions based on those. And everyone knows that's what wasn't happening. And that's the big problem. And then there's the whole scenario. We know about the no fault divorce thing. We know that it was supposed to. The big argument was, it just makes everything so much easier for the children when parents split up. Well, we know that's rubbish. We know the big fights are over custody and assets, and those big fights are still there. And if anything, I think you alluded to this earlier on, which is really important. If anything, we're finding that there's more acrimony now because nobody outside really knows whose fault it was, right? So there's a divorce. And because the courts hasn't been involved in saying, well, this is where the fault was, because there's no such thing anymore, everyone's wondering who's really to blame, right? And also everyone kind of the narrative, and I know this, the narrative can then slowly change, and it can change over time to, well, maybe the narrative wasn't that after all, maybe it was this, and maybe it wasn't their fault, it was that person's fault, and who knows? And then there's also evidence to suggest that, well, because of no fault divorce, because you can get out of it so easy, a lot of people aren't bothering to get married because you can get out of it so easy. We also know, Bruce, that the numbers of children going through the Kafka system are increasing exponentially every year. So it's more and more children. As fewer people are getting married, there's less permanency in relationships. We know what that means statistically, and fewer children, are enjoying the benefit of stable marriages. So they're more going through the Kafka system and all sorts of things like that. My question to you really is, what do we do about all this, Bruce? How do we sort it out? If you were a policy advisor, in 3 years' time, we may well have a new type of government. It's not a party political comment. It's an observation of fact. And 3 years is a long time. But we might at least have a strong opposition or even a new government with a different flavour, a different motive set, who knows. If you were advising on policy to fix this, Bruce, what would you advise?
Yeah, so I do have some policy recommendations. Let me just put some numbers on your scaling of the problem here. So by official government data, by the age of 14, about half of children in Britain are not living with both natural parents. And in 2022, which is the last year for which the Home Office collects this data, a quarter of all families were single-parent families. And obviously most of those will be mother, single parent. The single parent will be the mother. So there is not just a chronic problem of children growing up without parents, it's children growing up without fathers. And as you know, that has particular consequences, such as propensity to crime, particularly for boys, and propensity to drop out of school, etc. So these are real problems, and I have reason to believe the government is underestimating these problems. I do have some recommendations. I have published these. Let's go through the statutes first of all. So what we haven't mentioned so far, that under current statutes, so a statute is a law that is currently active. So the statutes at the moment do not define father rights. There are no father rights. Fathers have no rights in British law. And I know that there were plenty of lawyers with a self-interest out there who will say that's not true. Well, here is how they get to saying that's not true. Fathers do have rights. And that's because the statutes do recognize that there are two parents. But the statutes do not recognize any rights for fathers or mothers in particular. The statute
Correct.
has the sets up the inherently antagonistic position that one parent is what is called a primary carer, and the other parent is a secondary carer. That there is no chance in statute for equality of care, unless the two parents reach an agreement outside of the family system. Right? They would come to some mutual understanding. But statutes set up the contest because it's too self-interested for one parent to try to be the primary carer. So it is inherently unfair in statute. So to get to the bottom line, statute needs to be rewritten so that both parents are granted equal rights. So change the statute. Statute should be written. Both parents have equal rights, and that there should be no gender discrimination, which, by the way, conflicts with our other statutes on gender discrimination. Okay, so that's the first thing. That's just changing the statutes. And in fact, to be fair, I'll just mention there are some parties, including Advance UK and Reform, that have ran manifestos that there should be equal rights, and those need to be further specified. As I alluded to, there would have to be guidance to help courts to fulfill those equal rights where there are cases where one parent is more distant than the other, without the courts abusing their discretion and using distance to discriminate against men. So I think everybody gets the point there. Right. The second thing is I would like to criminalize alienation. So alienation is where one parent deliberately turns the child from the other parent, and this is somewhat natural. It's somewhat inevitable, but that doesn't excuse it. And just saying it's going to go, it happens, it's going to go on. That is not a sufficient response to the problem. That is by the way, that is the government's response. The government does not recognize alienation, even though it makes common sense, and it is well documented that parents will alienate their children from the other parent during the dispute about access. The government will not recognize the problem. So data that we have is not from the government. I'll quickly give one factum. A survey of more than 1,000 estranged parents found that at least 59% of them have experienced parental alienation. Now, by the way, this is gender biased too, because where does the parental alienation, where is it most likely to occur? It's most likely to occur with the primary carer. So the primary carer has more access to the child. And even if it's unintentional, the parent just cannot help themselves trying to point out to the child that the other parent is wrong, or and these are the reasons why we break up.
I think you raised some really important points. I think whoever comes in next is going to be looking at all these things, because we've lost a grip on a lot of issues. The primary one of which is, look, strong nations are built on strong families. And we know that marriage is the biggest indicator for family stability. And so that's the thing that I'm pretty convinced, if we do have a change of the type of government, instead of the, one side or the other that we've had at the moment.
Two cheeks on the same bottom, Tony. Remember, that's what you told me.
That's the one, yeah. Well, absolutely right. No, you're absolutely two cheeks of the same bottom. You're absolutely right. That's what we've got. And maybe we'll, hopefully, who knows, right? Who knows? But hopefully we'll get somebody who recognises, yeah, actually, we need to support strong families and then get out of the way and let people get on with their lives, instead of saying, no, we think we know better than parents and husbands and wives, and actually we should be deciding who can and can't be a good parent. Parenting is a privilege, not a right, and we'll decide whether you have the privilege. No, don't think that's a very good idea myself.
You're right. That is the root ideological problem, is people who think that they know better how everybody else should live.
Listen, you're very provocative, entertaining, thoughtful, erudite, and it's a real great pleasure to talk to you. I'm so grateful for your time. And hopefully somebody somewhere will listen to some of your policy ideas and will sort out what really is a system that is causing, in its overall aim to do good, it's also doing a lot of damage to a lot of people. And if we can sort that out somehow, it's got to be a good thing, right?
You're right. It's another road to hell, paved with good intentions.
Yeah.
Which we have spoken before, yeah.
Dr. Bruce Newsome, what a privilege. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I love talking with you, Tony. Thank you.